what's the world we want to live in? It's actually within our ability to make it better. And it's within our ability to make the affordable housing crisis better. But we just all have to really think and ask ourselves, what is the built environment that we want to live in?
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk podcast, a regular discussion with building industry professionals. Today I'm joined by designer Marianne Cusato. This is senior editor Patrick McComb. You can find Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk podcast and the original Fine Homebuilding podcast at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. You can leave feedback and ask questions there too. Marianne, it is such a pleasure to have you on the show and nice to meet you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
For folks who don't know, can you please, it's probably a long list, but can you please explain what you do?
Sure. I'm a designer. I practice in building and design and development of disaster housing, typically in at the moment in opportunity zones. And I'm also on the faculty at the School of Architecture at the University of Notre Dame, where I teach courses on housing, specifically housing and social justice, as well as we're just in the process of launching a new initiative that I'm the director of on housing and community regeneration.
Can you briefly explain to me what that means?
Absolutely. So we're within the School of Architecture at Notre Dame. We practice and look at how place influences economies, society, outcomes of how people live in cities. And one of the things we're looking very closely at is, the connection of place and the physical environment, the built environment, to how we live and our settlement patterns. So we work in the Midwest because that's where Notre Dame is located, and helping cities, specifically at the moment, the city of South Bend and the city of Kalamazoo, Michigan, to undo the damage that was done by urban renewal. So you'll have these, large infrastructure projects that sever cities, that have destroyed entire communities and cut off neighborhoods from the river, have destroyed retail. And so we're working with the cities to undo that damage and propose new designs that would be pedestrian friendly and hopefully attract and retain new talent to the area.
That's really interesting. So are there a recipe of strategies for putting these neighborhoods back together, or is it a case-by-case basis?
It's a great question because everything is local and everything is global. So as humans, there are certain principles that work better for how we live in the physical environment we're in. But at the same time, every community is so unique that it has to be calibrated. And so in each of these cities that we're working with, the damage was done in the 60s, but the lingering impact carries on. And the toolkit that was used to destroy, which essentially was tearing down as many buildings as possible and putting in large infrastructure. In South Bend, there's a cloverleaf intersection that could be a stop sign, but it's got the big green freeway signs, and it's just it's insane. It was built to facilitate getting Studebaker workers to an office or to the facility, and it opened as the Studebaker factory was closing. And it's just been sitting there ever since. And so in Kalamazoo, they had downtown, basically freeways through downtown that had been one-way streets. So we go in, and while the situation might be slightly different, the principles of placemaking are the same. You look at how you can make a multimodal transportation. So cars are welcome, but so are people and bikes and buses and other modes of transportation. And you engage the street. So you create places that people not only are safe to be, but they want to be. Right now, walkability is growing in awareness, and more and more people want to walk. They want to be part of a community. And so those principles are universal.
How does one prevent making some corrections in this bad development from gentrifying these neighborhoods? I mean, if you suddenly make it nicer, people can easily get priced out of where they're living.
That's such a key question. And the way you do that is through housing choice. You also do it through not limiting housing. So right now, 75% of America is zoned for single family housing only. Many of those places have minimum lot sizes and minimum square footages and minimum parking requirements. All of that embeds cost into housing. If you can design places, first of all, those places need to start allowing accessory dwelling units, the duplexes and other areas that allow for housing choice within existing neighborhoods. And as we build new areas that are infilling and capturing land back from failed infrastructure, that's a natural place to build in housing choice and have use what the term missing middle housing to add not just single family homes, but homes of varied size for different family structures. When you build one size fits all, and you limit the supply, it makes it much more expensive to build. But if you can unlock land that was otherwise not used for anything and offer housing choice within that, in parallel with offering housing choice in suburban areas, we can start to chip away at the problem.
I think most folks who are familiar with your work probably were introduced to it by your Katrina Cottages. You won awards, or at least an award for their design. Can you please talk about the cottages and the media attention it provided?
Yeah, so the cottage was the alternative idea to the FEMA trailer. Immediately after Hurricane Katrina, Andres Duane, the architect and town planner from who leads DPZ and was really credited with as one of the founders of the new urbanism movement, set out a challenge. We were invited down to Mississippi to offer design solutions at the urban level, regional planning, traffic codes, and as well as building design. And I was on the architecture team, and Andreas sent out a little email ahead of time saying somebody needs to come up with the alternative to the FEMA trailer. And my design kind of rose to the top of that. And it was the alternative to the FEMA trailer was designed to be rapidly deployed. It was built with the same technology that a regular house would be. It's a regular house, not a trailer, because there's no such thing as a short-term disaster. Maybe if you lose a few houses somewhere, that's fine. But these were tens of thousands of homes that were destroyed. And that means infrastructure is destroyed, and you're going to go through another hurricane cycle in the process of the recovery. So we were looking for solutions that could be part of the long-term solution, because right now you have, and still, sadly, you put in the temporary solution, and after the 18 months or however long that it's there, it can only go to a landfill. So our proposal was to build a building that could be part of a permanent solution. Either it stayed on the property and became an accessory dwelling unit, or it grew into the larger house, or it was moved to a group site somewhere and could be starter housing. And the idea was that different people might move in it. It might be in a different place, but the asset was something that the resources that we put towards the solution, they were part of a long-term solution.
Unlike a trailer, which has a very, finite lifespan, right? Maybe 10 years, it's maybe designed to last, right?
Maybe. And if you live in it full time for 18 months, the travel trailers, the only place they can go is a landfill.
Was that a fun project, or was it stressful? Did you get satisfaction from that process?
Oh, completely. I mean, there's stress in everything, but when it's meaningful, the stress melts away, because it was, in anything, there's, you put up an idea, and there's always somebody sitting on the outskirts saying, no. But when you go up against the FEMA trailer, similar to how when we went up against the clover leaves in South Bend, you really don't have opposition. There's not a champion of the FEMA trailer. Nobody's out there saying, this is the best thing ever. Nobody's saying, I really need a cloverleaf intersection. So depending on the fight you're choosing, if you choose the right fight, you don't have anyone opposing it. FEMA doesn't like the FEMA trailer. They have to throw them away at the end. It's extremely wasteful. So when we were making these, arguments that, hey, there's another way of doing this, and it feels daunting, but we could do better. And at the same time, we're getting the attention of FEMA. We ended up having a pilot program we changed a law because at the time it was illegal for FEMA to put a permanent structure in. Now they can. It didn't go far enough. There's actually some movement right now to take that even further and achieve some of the things we'd hoped to achieve back in the day. So there's some, stay tuned on that. It could be very exciting to make some adjustments there.
Briefly, what are you hoping will happen?
We would love to see the code or the law changed again to continue to incentivize long-term solutions as part of the immediate action. And that would mean stockpiling ahead of time. It would mean even sort of coding for accessory dwelling units. There's ways of doing that could help to frame whether a city is going to allow the temporary solution to stay, because part of it is that every municipality has its own code. So you have to be able to find ways of increasing the quality of what's being delivered. Because right now, even though the code allows it, what's being delivered isn't something a community would want to have as a long-term solution. And so we're hoping to find ways to increase the potential of having the short-term and immediate solution be desirable enough that a city would say, yeah, you can leave that here. And we want that as part of our community.
You're a graduate of Notre Dame and you teach there. Can you please tell me the exact classes you're teaching?
Yeah, so I teach a course called U.S. Housing and Social Justice. It actually came out of a combination of things. The work that I'm doing, if you look at the Katrina Cottage, when we started building them places, they were illegal because they were too small. We were trying to build back some of the communities in Mississippi that were the most beloved communities, wiped away. The next day they were illegal to build. And so we were fighting against these codes that they're essentially embedded all over the U.S. and fighting to build a mix of uses, to pull buildings up to the street, to create walkable communities, and they're illegal. And so as I was in the trenches fighting this, what I didn't actually fully understand, I'm not a historian, I'm trained, I have a degree in architecture, I design buildings for a living. What I didn't understand was actually the policies that were put in place were actually a legacy of redlining and the historic sort of nature of how we segregate. And as I got into that history and understanding of it, The Color of Law was a very influential book when it came out in 2018 for my understanding of how it's a book by Richard Rothstein, how our cities are formed. I immersed myself in. So I teach a course. We look at the history, the legacy, and the future of understanding why our built environment looks the way it does, why it performs the way it does, with a lens towards moving forward to build a more equitable future. I'm also working on this new initiative for housing and community regeneration. We're creating a new category called an educational charrette, where we lead some dean's charrettes, which we go in and work with cities as professionals to a degree. We hire professionals. The faculty lead. We hire students. They work side by side with us as professionals to offer visions and help communities that are in the process of trying to envision a piece or a part of their city, not quite ready to hire a real firm. They bring us in to help with the visioning piece of it. And I come back to school and I have a course that does the follow-up work on that.
That's really cool. So the first class you mentioned, is that an elective or is that a requirement for the architecture program?
They're electives.
And to me, that kind of work would seem to attract a more idealistic architecture student. Is that true, or do you have a mix of architecture students in that class?
We have a mix. So in the housing class, it's not just architecture. Architecture students are usually the minority in the class. We have a lot of real estate students, political science students, finance students. It's a mix, which is fantastic, because then we also have a different lens to which somebody's looking. Are they coming with a more finance-based understanding of how a built environment works? Or are they coming from the political science side? Or are they coming from the design and architecture side? So the students, the discussions we're able to have are incredible because of that, because it's that because it has students, poverty studies students, and so the American studies students. The richness of the conversation couldn't be matched if we were in our silo. I think by the nature of the course, people self-select to be in it. It's but what I find, I teach at a unique time. I teach in the evenings, and it also means that I get a certain number of people. I teach it once a week. That is the only class that meets the requirement for their minor, and they have to take it. And so I do get, when I go around the class and say, "Why are you here? What are you hoping to get out of this?" At the beginning, I get several that have said, "I've looked into this. I believe this. I want to do this." I get those. And then I get the one that sort of sheepishly looks at me and says, "Yeah, I was here. This is the only class, the only way I'm going to get my minor." And I love those students because one, they keep the conversation a little fresher. But also, a few weeks in, I have a reading response due at a few hours before every class, and so I can facilitate the conversation. I know that they've all read, and I ask them key points of what are your questions, what resonated with you, just basic stuff, just to make sure that I can facilitate a richer conversation. And I love reading the students that didn't necessarily choose to take the class over the course of the semester, saying, "Wow, I didn't know what I was getting into, but this is fascinating." So it's and we have very uncomfortable conversations sometimes because the lived experience of people in the class is very different. You have people that have lived through housing segregation, that are living through gentrification. One student last year, when she was in high school, would go to a little corner store, and she lived in Brooklyn, and went home 1 year and it turned into a vegan bakery. This is the lived experience. I mean, and then other people that come from a very different background that weren't aware that any of this happened, and that it's still happening because we don't talk about it. We assume that everything was fixed in the 60s when the Civil Rights Act happened. I mean, we know it's not, but also if it's not your lived experience, it's very easy to not see it, and it's hiding in plain sight.
I have to think that the greatest benefit of higher learning is meeting people who are different than you and having, meaningful conversation and learning together.
Yeah.
I recently learned that you've designed affordable housing for workers in Southern Florida. Can you talk about that project and who it's for?
Sure. Yeah, we worked in the Florida Keys for a little bit. We're actually putting our focus at the moment on the panhandle of Florida, and in both cases working during hurricane recovery. So in the Keys, it was Irma in 2017. In the panhandle in Panama City, where we've shifted our focus at this point, it's in following from 2018 Hurricane Michael. And these communities, in any disaster, it reveals the disaster that was there the day before. So, I mean, there's a housing crisis everywhere. It's usually heightened in a coastal area, especially in the Keys, which is a resort area where people go on vacation. But there's a lot. I mean, the housing crisis is, extraordinary down there. In Panama City, it was a city that's sort of left behind by time, and there's amazing things happening there now. The downtown of what we love about working in Panama City is that the downtown, immediately after the hurricane, the city hired Dover Cole out of Florida to come in. They're a planning firm, and do a master plan and a new zoning code. And so we're able to work and build accessory dwelling units in our backyards, duplexes, fourplexes. We can put housing choice in. So we can take land that otherwise would just be for a single family. Before the storm would have been for a single family home. And now we can put 3 housing units on it. And so we're able to add that housing choice in. And so after a disaster, there's political capital, there's political desire to make a change, and funding coming in. So we're privately funded. We've sort of avoided the federal funding side of things after Katrina. That was a very painful process. But there's interest and need, and we find that these markets that have been left behind in many ways by time offer offer great opportunity to activate land that's just sitting there, create place, and hopefully create some help some neighborhoods to stabilize.
Was forgive me for my ignorance. Panama City was hit with a hurricane, or this was just a development change? Okay.
No, it was 2018 Hurricane Michael hit in October.
And
The Mexico Beach would be more. It was the one that came up, and it was just out of nowhere, and then hit. The epicenter was the eye went through in Mexico Beach, and this is just a little bit to the east of that, the west of that.
Does it always take a disaster to make people want to make a change?
It shouldn't. I think it shouldn't, because the disaster's there the day before, and we just live with it. And it's everywhere, and it's not just in places that get hurricanes or fires. We worked a little bit out in Sonoma County following the wildfires. And disaster markets are complex, but at the same time, you do get that moment where everybody actually wants to get things happening. So sometimes the permit process can be faster and more streamlined sometimes.
So why should people who already have a house worry about housing affordability? And I think this is, a question related to a bigger issue of NIMBYism, right?
Yeah.
So why should we want to provide affordable housing?
Well, a society that doesn't work for everyone doesn't actually work for anyone. That there's a couple of really good books on this. One is called The Sum of Us, and it's the idea of the book is that, or the premise, the thesis of it is that our country is set up on a zero-sum game, which is if you win, I lose. And it's this mentality that once you get yours, you're all set. But that's really self-defeating. Not only is it, I don't think it's who we aspire to be. I actually don't think that's who America is. But setting that aside, it's economically not viable. It means that we leave opportunity and invention and the economy on the table. We by pushing others down or not doing anything to help them out, we're creating a community and a society that doesn't actually serve anyone. When a school teacher, I just read an article about somewhere in California, there's no school teacher housing, so they've reached out to everyone in the community and said, will you rent a room to a teacher? And it's just like, come on. Like, really? Like, we can't have dignified housing for our teachers. We can't have dignified housing for the people that hold up our society. And so, yeah, maybe as an individual, we don't personally, if you aren't personally affected by this, but your community, everyone is affected by a housing shortage. And maybe the, individuals aren't affected, but someone in their family is, especially post-COVID. I saw a stat that before COVID, that 30% of America was housing and or food insecure. I mean, that's an extraordinary number of a percentage of our society that's not fully engaged. Because if you're housing and food insecure, you're not doing all of the other things that enhance society. You're not part of being able to break the cycle, even, because it just holds children into it. And then we look and say, well, work harder. It's like, well, how could someone work harder when a system is set up? So how much do we put into sort of as a society helping people that are trapped in a system that we're actively trapping them in? If you can create housing choices and affordable housing solutions and stabilized housing, people become part of the workforce. They become part of a thriving, economically stable community. That starts with housing, because if you don't have a place to live that's safe, that's secure, that you're going to be there, how are your kids going to study in school? Are you going to, if you're in school, study for your spelling or your math test if you don't know where you're sleeping the next night? So this is an issue that touches all of us, even if it doesn't personally touch within where we are. And we are set up on a zero-sum game, and it's to all of our peril.
Do you? I was going to ask you, do you think we're making any headway? But maybe a better question is, where do you think we're doing a good job with providing more affordable housing and reasonable development so folks can get a place of their own that's stable?
I think the fact that actually that you see, the city of Minneapolis just changed over. It used to be just Portland and Santa Clara, California were the only places that allowed accessory dwelling units. Now you have entire municipalities. South Bend changed theirs, Kalamazoo changed theirs. So not even the major cities, but Minneapolis was a big one, that have changed their zoning to eliminate exclusionary zoning. And that, to be clear, when you eliminate single family zoning, you're not eliminating single family housing. You're just saying you can still build your single family house, but others can be built too. And you can code the height. So we're not saying getting rid of exclusionary zoning means that we're now going to put Midtown Manhattan in your community. And so there's so much fear around what any of these things mean. But the fact that it's actually a conversation that people know about, and of course you get the natural rebound to that, which is almost a good thing, because at least if there's people overcorrecting, it means that there's enough of a movement in the right direction that there's people on the other end freaking out. Might actually be a good indicator, because that means that there's things happening and there's positive progress in certain areas. So, I mean, there's always something positive to see, even if you're at a point where it doesn't always seem like it. There's always something positive. I mean, for me, the positive is that I work with these amazing students every day that, they're going to save us all. We messed it up and it's theirs to fix, and they're taking that on within the school, within the university. They want to go out and change the world. They don't like the way it looks and they want it to be better. That is a tremendous amount of hope, in that at least I think the next generation is extremely aware that the world around them is not the world they want to live in, and that they actually feel like they can do something about it, because the rest of us have been sleepwalking.
It's heartening to hear that, because someone has to do something.
Yeah, it's here's the class, sorry guys, here it is. I mean,
when you drive around South Bend and elsewhere, do you like the housing and buildings you're seeing under construction, both from a practicality and aesthetic viewpoint?
Mix. I think actually in the city of South Bend just did an amazing thing. They're doing pre-approved plans that are designed for infill. So they have front porches. They're designed to face the street. We still have, too much of the garage front in, out, up, down. I mean, that's been the default setting for decades, and that's going to be a hard one to move away from for some people. So when I see that, it's just well, who lives in this house? Person or the car? It's and all the up and down and in and out. It's just come on, we don't need the 30 gables. It's not just tone it down. So when I see that, I don't drive in neighborhoods where that's being built, but I know it still is. I think that as an industry and as a profession, the development industry, the design and architecture industry, we haven't done a great job, if we're being really honest, since, the hit-miss ratio, if you will, is off. And so when I see a construction sign going up, I get a little nervous, because, what's coming? And so I get it. I get that we have not delivered on the promise of, that more is better, that when you build in a community that where you have a mix of uses and walkable streets, that principle is that if you add more to that it will be better. But we haven't always delivered on that. So we put buildings in that don't respect the street. We isolate. We build roads for the sake of roads. And very often when new development comes, it isn't the best thing. So, we have to sharpen our pencils, and for those of us that still use pencils, but we need to do better, and do better explaining, and do better at listening. to create communities that do have lasting value and not a short-term flash in the pan, where I'm only going to live in it till I can move out of it mentality, because that's what got us in the problem. I mean, how much the impact to the climate, to the economy, to our personal health that it takes to do a drive till you qualify house is, I mean, it's that you can't even quantify how much damage that does on every level of society to use the settlement patterns that we use as default. And so looking to development patterns that allow for walkability, allow for connection to community, allow actually retail to thrive, and all of these things, it's not in most places the default. And so we need to do better. I mean, and we have all the toolkits. We just need to do better.
Let's hope it doesn't take a disaster.
Yeah, well, and the one thing that the disasters do is they give models, and then you can look at a place like Panama City and say, wow, like, how do we get that? How do we get that? Or a place like South Bend, even, who's so progressive towards understanding the built environment, and Kalamazoo that didn't take a disaster to change their code and to get rid of the infrastructure. They're doing it. And I mean, people are moving. In the last census, people moved into South Bend for the first time since the Studebakers closed in the 60s instead of Granger, which was our suburban counterpart. It was the first time there was a population growth in the city of South Bend as opposed to the suburban neighbor. They shrunk, we grew. And that's because of the commitment of the city. So it doesn't always take a disaster. It just takes good leadership.
In addition to your design practice and teaching at Notre Dame, you're also a published author. Can you please talk about your books?
Yeah. So I wrote a book called Get Your House Right, and then carried it on the extension of that book in Fine Homebuilding with the design build column. And the premise of the book is architecture is a language. It has a vocabulary and has a grammar. We all know the grammar or the vocabulary, which are the windows, the eaves, the doors, the roof. But over time, we've lost the understanding of the grammar. So when you walk down a street and it doesn't quite feel right of a newly constructed homes, very often it's because the grammar is not used correctly. So the premise of the book was to show an avoid and a use, so you can train your eye to see the difference and where the common mistakes happen, because they tend to happen in the same places all the way through. So it was a compare and contrast. We actually, at the time, we had it's timely. We had a foreword by then Prince Charles, now King Charles, who's very interested in understanding the impact of the built environment in society, and has been influential in leading that. So we're looking forward to his wisdom as king. But the premise of both was that very often, because I would design something and somebody would look at it and they'd say, yeah, that's exactly what I do. And then they would build something else because our eye is trained. Like when we did the Katrina Cottage, I had someone say, I can do exactly that. I was like, okay, great. And they're like, we might change this and we might change that, but it's exactly the same. It's not exactly the same. Like my roof slope was this, and you've just done this. And some of it's the nonsense nonsense sentence stuff, like the shutter that could never cover the opening. And I can't sing in tune. I don't even know what it might be to do that, but I recognize when someone's not. And so the idea of art and architecture and any of these creations that we make is that nature has certain proportions, and the human eye can see them. So if a human eye sees the shutter that could never cover the window, they know that the grammar's not right. They don't know why, but it doesn't feel right. And so this book seeks, and the Fine Homebuilding column, we're seeking to elevate that conversation. The Fine Homebuilding went into more detail. With the book, we had to stay pretty much design only. With Fine Homebuilding, when I wrote that column, it was all of the things that we didn't get to do in the book. So it was the next level up. If Get Your House Right is the intro course, this was the 200 level course.
That might be the nicest thing that anyone's ever said about Fine Homebuilding.
Oh, it's fantastic. Oh my God, I love that magazine.
I feel very grateful to work here. I really do. How How were you introduced to architectural design as a field? Did you have people influencing you growing up?
Well, I lived in Alaska, and we would always go down to California, as Alaskans do, during spring break. And my parents wanted to move down there, so they were always going to little show houses. So we were going through different houses, and I thought, well, they'd hand you the little floor plan when you went in. And it was every year the yearly pilgrimage to consider whether when my sister and I graduated from high school, whether they would move down. And so I had a little collection of floor plans, and I would go home and I would draw my little floor plans up. And this was in grade school. And then my parents gave me the floor plans to the house that they had built, and so I could measure things. And so I was doing little. I never could get vertical. I tried once to draw an elevation, and I just couldn't do it. So I generated lots of little golf course condos in floor plan with sunken living rooms, because things like that, that was very important.
Right.
And all the bells and whistles. And so then in 7th grade, I found out that astronauts had to have 20/20 vision. So my real dream was crushed, and I made the final decision that I needed to be an architect, clearly. So I stuck with it. Then, of course, I got to school, and I loved it. I loved learning architecture, but I started practicing. I went and worked for an architecture firm and looked around and realized, I don't actually want to be an architect. I want to stay in the profession, but what these guys are doing every day is not actually what I want to do. And
were they designing like over-the-top single-family homes or commercial projects, or what was the firm doing mostly?
Combination. So the first firm that I worked with was doing both large single-family houses as well as infill within new urbanism, and I loved that. And I loved learning about the other stuff. But my heart's definitely not in high-end residential. And then I went to a firm that was doing super high-end residential, and I was doing the New York thing, and it was like, oof, I didn't have that same, like, my bosses would come in with like the new project, and everyone would gather around and be like, oh, we get to do this. And I'm just like, all right. But I cared more. I was writing Get Your House Right. And I wanted to learn that world, because I think it's important to understand it, to then bring that sensibility to the other spectrum. So the other end of the spectrum. So that was always the plan. But I thought that I wanted to actually have an architecture firm that was doing that. And what I realized was I enjoyed writing Get Your House Right. I enjoyed trying to solve housing. And the issues that I cared about were like 2% design, and everything else was about delivery. And so that's why I shifted and went into sort of the path that I'm in, which is essentially, it's still an allied field to architecture, and I teach architecture and I design buildings, but it's focusing on the development, focusing on even like, how do we get the house as product? How do we take it off site? How do you deliver it? Because design is great. Design is essential. Design is the glue that holds it together. And the architect has the ability to communicate in all of the different categories. Like, the architect has to understand what how every user. So if you're designing a hospital, you have to understand how hospitals work. If you're designing a house, you're designing a school or a fire station or any type, you have to understand not only the use, but you have to understand structure. You have to understand the economics of it, the mechanics of it, how you heat and cool something. And so it's really one of the last generalist professions. And I loved that. I loved the urbanism piece of it. I loved, I used to think architecture was the building, but it's the city. And you can't take the building out of the city. And so that's especially with the community regeneration work we're doing at Notre Dame. It's city first, and then the buildings follow. And if you get the city right, it relieves a lot of pressure on the building. And so when we look at place and settlement patterns, to me, that's the fascinating discussion. And looking at, I was building these Katrina cottages, and they were illegal. And now I understand why, because of the history of housing segregation. And so those are the areas that I'm so glad I didn't go down the conventional architecture path, because all of the things that I find most interesting are woven in a very indirect path around, and much more meaningful.
This is my favorite part of the show oftentimes. It's time to come clean about your own house. What's it look like? Does it have a porch that faces this street? Can you talk about it?
So I live in a house that somebody else designed, first of all, and that's the first thing. And everyone's like, do you have your dream home? Do you live in your dream home? No. I think that maybe at some point. Recently, I'm very proud, I actually purchased one of the homes that I've designed. That was a major thing. I don't live in it yet, but one of the homes that I've actually designed that does have a front porch and lives all of my values is in Florida. And so that's I'm currently renting it, but actually considering not renting it and having a place to go to. So I do have a house with a front porch. I live in a townhouse because I actually like walls attached to things, and I like to be able to leave and not worry about it. I don't like mowing yards, so I tip towards the urban side of my value set rather than living in the house. It ticks. I wrote another book called The Just Right Home, and you'll never find the perfect place. I mean, there's, some people get the absolute perfect, but there's always some sort of something has to trump something else. So for me, it was choosing a townhouse that allowed me to leave when I wanted and not have 4 individual walls, and also be close in proximity to school. So I'm pretty close to school and I can pop over, but I do not have a front porch. I wish I did. Sometimes, but
any interior projects? Are you allowed to make changes to the building in your building?
I am. And at some point, the cobbler has no shoes. You just sort of I'm designing other.
That's why this is my favorite part of the show, because it's
I mean, over time, yeah, but we'll see. My microwave. I need a new microwave, so I'm going appliance shopping this weekend, and that might spiral into something a little bit more than planned. You never know how those things go.
Appliances are pretty cool nowadays. I think you'll find.
I know. Well, and I watch them. I keep my eye on things because I have to specify them. So
sure.
We'll see. I've got a couple. Kind of dreamed of, because that means clearly I need a new dishwasher. If your microwave goes, I mean, isn't that how that works? I really kind of wanted the 2 drawers so I could just rotate. The dishes just.
I want that too, but wait till you see what they cost. Oh my gosh, It's mind blowing. Yeah, it's like 5 times the cost of like 2 dishwashers. Maybe that's the way to go if you have enough room.
I don't.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Is there anything that you want to ask or tell our audience before we go?
I think that we all, when we think of building and design, we should all ask ourselves, what's the world we want to live in? And it's really easy to think, you put blinders on, you start at your house, and then we zone out through all of the ugly stuff, and we get to where we're going. And we do that all day long, and we'll chat on the phone while we're driving. We'll do all of these things, but we'll never actually look at the world around us. And it's actually within our ability to make it better. And it's within our ability to make the affordable housing crisis better. But we just all have to really think and ask ourselves, what is the built environment that we want to live in? And how do we want to engage with it? And I think that this is actually, things always have to get a little bit worse to get better. Mm-hmm. And so I'm hoping that the moment we're in is the moment that we can course correct a little bit and make an environment that works, is sustainable to financially maintain, and also helps to build a stronger society. But that's actually a choice that we all, both in the profession and out, can make. And so, I mean, that's the challenge out, is where do we want to live when we grow up?
Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks to Marianne Cusato for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Keep craft alive. Think about where you want to live.